Apologies about the technical difficulties. It's our new world in which we are held hostage by technology. And I was just, as we were trying to troubleshoot, I tried to type, I am an attendee, but it auto-corrected to I am stranded. And that's really how it feels when technology does not work. But um, it's always fun for us to host the World Affairs lectures. For us, it's a time for the FIT community to get together to think about a world beyond 27th Street. And this time, really due to popular demand, we are focusing on a sort of different part of the world we haven't talked about in a while, but that is so important and so complex and layered. And many people here in New York don't really think about too often. So we're really excited to host this event focusing on Africa. And my job here is just to welcome you all to the World Affairs Lecture and, of course, introduce my colleague, Dr. Souzeina Mushtaq, who will be moderating the event and introducing our speaker. Dr. Mushtaq is a professor at the University of Wisconsin in River Falls, and her research focuses on queer Muslim women and their intersecting identities. And I am happy to turn the floor over to Dr. Mushtaq.
Thank you, Dr. Levine. It's my pleasure to be here moderating this event, World Affairs Lecture for State University of New York, FIT. As you know, that COVID-19 pandemic brought our lives to a creaking halt. It disrupted everything from education to our healthcare system, from travel to trade, even the way we socialize, as Dr. Levine just mentioned. We were forced to move our lives online. But besides bringing everything to a standstill, COVID-19 pandemic also increased the extent of inequalities in the world. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, more than 3.1 million people have died, and 120 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty. And not only that, as the world continues to plunge into a massive global recession, rich people are getting richer. According to the data, global billionaire wealth grew by $4.4 trillion between 2020 and 2021, as millions of people fell below the poverty line. And according to the World Bank, by the end of 2022, an additional 75 million people will be pushed into poverty, something they had not predicted before the pandemic. Now, with the war in Ukraine and rising inflation, the effects of the pandemic have worsened. Food and fuel prices have skyrocketed. As IMF in one of their reports wrote, and I quote, "COVID-19 has not been an equal opportunity virus." Quote ends. Clearly, we are not in this together. Today's topic deals with the impact of the pandemic on the African continent. And research after research shows that the COVID-19 pandemic worsened the inequality in African countries. For example, the inequality in access to the vaccines, which the World Health Organization Director General has called the vaccine apartheid. This inequality has led to a two-track pandemic, where populations in high-income countries have gotten the booster COVID-19 vaccinations, while the populations in low-income countries have not even received their first dose of the vaccines. And according to World Health Organization, only 15% of the African population is fully vaccinated. To talk more about this and other issues that the pandemic brought forth in African countries, we have our special guest, Dr. Cyril Obi, with us today. Dr. Obi is a program director at the Social Science Research Council and leads the African Peacebuilding Network program. He was also a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, Sweden. And in 2004, he was awarded the Claude Akay Visiting Chair at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at the University of Uppsala. Dr. Obi is also a research associate of the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and a visiting scholar to the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University, New York. Dr. Obi also serves on the editorial boards of several reputable journals, including African Affairs, African Conflict and Peacebuilding Review, African Security Review, among others. He also serves as the general editor of the Routledge book series on peace, conflict, and security in Africa. Today, Dr. Obi will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. And if you have any questions in between the talk, please use the chat option. Welcome to FIT, Dr. Obi. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mushtaq, for a very, very generous introduction, as well as a very nice segue into the topic that I'm about to address today. My topic is inequality, conflict, and peace, emerging trends in a post-pandemic Africa. I want to thank the organizers of this talk for inviting me, and I hope I will be able to discipline myself and keep to the 25 minutes. But I would start by saying we are living in a time of uncertainties, crisis, and conflicts linked to the unprecedented levels of social inequality and injustices. However, in spite of the initial fears and early predictions of an impending pandemic-related catastrophe in Africa, the continent's infection and fatality rates were among the lowest in the world. However, some commentators have called for caution over this overly optimistic reading of Africa's resilience and capacity to right the pandemic, noting, and I quote, that all this good news can turn bad. And I'm sorry to say that that turned out, or is turning out, to be true. It should be noted that the continent still faces formidable challenges, given low vaccination rates. Less than 9% of the total population is covered, partly due to lack of access to adequate amounts of vaccines and testing facilities, bottlenecks in storage and distribution of vaccines, dire socioeconomic conditions, violence, lack of information, or vaccine hesitancy. Such challenges also include direct or indirect implications of the pandemic for existing structural and social inequalities, vulnerabilities, violence, and peace in Africa. An Oxfam report echoes the point made about unequal access to vaccines by noting that 11% of Africans had been vaccinated by early February this year, compared to 71% of vaccines. However, while the infection and mortality rates linked to the pandemic appear to be mild compared to other regions of the world, its economic impact on Africa has been significantly adverse. The twists and turns of the emerging post-pandemic global order requires a close understanding of the complex nexus between inequality, conflict, and peace if we are to address emerging risks, including the economic turmoil currently ravaging Africa. This paper focuses on socioeconomic and political inequality in Africa. According to the former Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, the COVID-19 pandemic has reversed 2 decades of development in Africa. Furthermore, the ECA's economic report notes that COVID-19 has pushed 55 million Africans into poverty. Those are the figures 2 years ago, 2020, and reversed more than 2 decades of progress in poverty reduction on the continent. It also reported that 15 African countries were in the risk of debt distress, while government policies in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic were accentuating gender inequalities, pushing more women into poverty. A recent Oxfam report notes that Africa, and I quote, is facing a crisis of extreme inequality. It goes on to assert that Africa contains 7 of the 10 most unequal countries in the world, and alludes to the fact that the concentration of wealth in the hands of the richest citizens. Quoting also, I go on to say that the top 1% holds a quarter of the wealth in all countries, with over 40% and over 40% in 14 countries. So we've spoken about gender inequality, income inequality, inequality between the rich and the poor, inequality between urban and rural areas. And in Southern and Eastern Africa, a major aspect is racial inequality, with white and Asian communities having higher income and wealth than their black counterparts. The data also point to reductions in GDP growth rate as ranging from -2.6 to -10.6 across African countries, coupled with reduction in household income, reduced government revenues, and increases in extreme poverty, and projects that there will be a 4% increase in the number of people living in extreme poverty across Africa, with Nigeria as the worst affected country, with 7 out of 10 people moving into extreme poverty. Now, if you imagine that Nigeria has a population of about 200 million, do the math. If 70% of that population has moved into extreme poverty. So what does this really mean in terms of inequality? It is important to point out that COVID-19 did not cause the crisis of poverty in Africa, which is rooted in itself in structural inequalities linked to the continent's colonial past and post-colonial external economic dependence. However, government policies in response to the pandemic have contributed to the widening of pre-pandemic inequalities and poverty levels. The ways in which COVID-19 disrupted global trade and financial systems were sharply reflected in Africa's monocultural and export commodity dependent economies. According to Mohammed, the pandemic led to both supply and demand shocks in sub-Saharan Africa and a decline in GDP export earnings, income, and employment. Another analyst, Blockhuis, in 2021 noted how the pandemic adversely impacted work, school, and income. According to him, an estimated 1/3 of workers stopped working, and the remaining 2/3 who kept their jobs saw their income decrease between 11.55 to 15.6%. Millions of Africans lost their jobs, and those in the informal sector witnessed a decline in their incomes. The IMF and World Bank data since 2020 have indicated the shrinkage of the economies of sub-Saharan African countries and the grim prospects. Of note, while the devastating effects of the pandemic on tourism and hospitality industries, local manufacturing, commodity export, trade, and international remittances. The same scenario holds when you consider school attendance, as schools were forced to shut down for many months. Some say 10 months in some countries, even longer in others. In a context where access to internet and online learning resources are largely unavailable. So learning effectively was really badly impacted. And when you consider the fate of public schools, you can then imagine what we are talking about here. Women and girls have been more impacted by the shutting down of workplaces, loss of livelihoods, closure of schools, with many suffering from increased levels of domestic abuse and gender-based violence, dropping out of school and losing incomes, resulting in what I will call the feminization of poverty. While some estimates assert that the rates of unemployment doubled between 2019 and 2020, the disproportionate number of those affected are women. And so there are many studies on the effect of shutdowns in various countries, and I do not want to go into all that in the interest of time. But I argue that what is not usually addressed is the impact of the pandemic on political inequality in Africa. I argue that the combination of economic and political inequality has had far-reaching ramifications for peace and development on the continent. Political inequality is often expressed in terms of the relationship between the state and society, actually the gap between the state and society, social classes, center and periphery, dominant versus subordinate or marginalized groups. It is common for political inequality to deepen in periods of economic crisis when access to resources is constrained and struggles intensify over shrinking resources, or dominant groups seek to exclude others from accessing scarce resources while they increase what they had controlled in the past. Under such conditions of exploitation, resistance, exclusion, and challenges to dominant forces, violence is often used as a means of advancing opposing interests or repressing demands for access, justice, or rights. So it is clear that the pandemic itself was not really the problem ab initio, but it contributed to the deepening of the socioeconomic and political crisis on the continent. The responses of African governments have in some cases, or indeed in most cases, worsened the problem. And the crisis of inequality in Africa has therefore taken the heat of such wrong-headed policies and responses. And so you have this being really pronounced because of the ineffectiveness of poverty reduction, bad governance, the absence of social safety nets, high levels of corruption and impunity by those in power. It is against this background that we seek to fully unpack the ramifications between inequality, conflict, and peace, the emerging trends, and the prospects for the future. This talk is organized into 4 broad sections: the introduction, the conceptual aspects, the link between conflict, political instability, and peace, and the 4th looks at the prospects for the future. There are several theoretical approaches to the inequality conflict nexus, and these are hinged on a positive, negative, or non-existent causal relationship between both concepts. Now, we'll not go into much details, but a key additional concept is the concept of grievance, that people feel that there's a relationship between inequality and grievance is a trigger for violence, either in terms of struggling for resources, struggling for rights, or repressing struggles for access to resources or demands for social justice and rights. But what is important in terms of what we are discussing this morning is that in this lecture, we shall zero in on the relationship between inequality and conflict by examining some of the mainstream approaches to conflict in Africa. The natural resource curse, the greed versus grievance thesis, which tend to dominate the narratives or their derivatives, which tend to dominate the narratives on conflict in Africa and tend not to associate conflict with inequality, even when confronted with the evidence of how horizontal inequality and violence have unfolded in the emerging crisis. Now, the natural resource curse basically says that when a country or society has abundant resources, it is cursed by corruption, violence, and all kinds of things also associated with the paradox of plenty. This is a very simplified version, but in the interest of time, I will not go into that. But I will simply quote Savoya and Sen, 2021, who note that underexplored areas in the political economy of natural resources include the effects of income inequity, poverty, education, health, and living standards. In other words, inequality in context even of resource wealth can lead to serious problems. And when you look at countries like Nigeria, Angola, Sudan, you would see that seeming connection between resource endowment and conflict. But I argue that grievances indeed are tied to inequality, particularly distributive inequalities, where majority of the populations are locked out of access to the basic necessities of life and resources. But let us look at the greed versus grievance. The greed versus grievance basically says that natural resources provide an opportunity structure, and that people who adopt violence are simply looking for an opportunity to access natural wealth. In other words, it's about resource capture. It's about people, about natural resources incentivizing social violence. Basically, that people are looking for opportunities to loot. And that is where all this talk about conflict diamonds, conflict cocoa, conflict oil have come from. That it's not really about inequality, it's just about people who are opportunistically trying to grab resources and using violence as a means to an end. I will not go beyond this. I will just say that given the argument that inequality in combination with other historical factors fuel conflict, the emphasis on this lecture is on political conflict. Political conflict manifests itself at several levels and in various forms. It ranges from everyday resistance to autocratic and unpopular state policies, state repression, marginalization, and exclusion, to insurgencies by non-state actors, including communal, ethnic, and extremist groups, challenging state authority in various contexts. Let me then go on and then look at some of the aspects of political violence based on the thesis that the ways in which hegemonic and dominant forces that benefit from the unequal distribution of political power and the majority of and the marginalization of the majority have sought to roll back democracy in Africa and stifle demands for justice, equity, and peace is actually to use state violence. And I look at the various ways because my argument is that democracy ideally should actually offer the framework for resolving a lot of these inequalities and inequities. But it's not happening. The reason for that is something I will deal with in the question and answer session. But there are various ways and manifestations of political repression, either in terms of the extension of constitutional provisions for people to be presidents for longer than 2 terms. And I list the countries as Guinea, Togo, Uganda, Chad, Rwanda, Egypt, Burundi, and Cote d'Ivoire as countries where the constitution has been changed. There are also liberation movements that have turned to political parties that do not allow any real form of opposition and have dominated power. I also talk about the quality of elections that really do not give people a choice. And also the latest trend, which is military coup d'etat, which, while overthrowing unpopular governments and being welcome as liberators, actually have very little to offer by way of an alternative. I'll round up in the next 5 minutes because I can see that I'm getting signals. The thing is, the other major point I want to make is that the regional and global responses to conflict trends in post-pandemic Africa do not fundamentally address the roots of inequality. Rather, they tend to leverage and prioritize strategic and economic interests and try basically to curtail or neutralize the spread of violent extremism by jihadi groups, while ignoring the fact that these jihadi groups are able to find an incubator and fertile breeding grounds because of gaps left behind by state absence in marginal regions and areas, as well as growing inequalities in which rural and places at the margins do not have access to the basic things of life. The issue of promoting political equality and social justice will hold the key to development and peace in post-pandemic Africa. I argue, and this is easier said than done, that African elites and the international community should realize that the days of doing business as usual are no longer with us. And that in the face of the looming global economic and climate crisis, widening divisions between rich and the poor, and former impoverishment of the chunk of humanity, aging democracy is in need of a radical remake. And the emerging trends call for new ideas and innovative transformation. Now I'm just going to read my conclusion, and it's not long, it's just 1 page. The COVID-19 pandemic has had the effect of accentuating the wide divisions and contradictions embedded and reproduced by the political and economic inequalities in the world, which have been acutely expressed in Africa. The trends in inequality and conflict on the continent suggest that peace and development will be further undermined in the near future. The multiple crises confronting the continent are linked to the structural unequal relations and the marginalized position of Africa in the international political economy. The way forward will logically suggest a change of direction that addresses the roots of inequality between Africa and the global powers, the inequality between African states, and between the dominant elites and ordinary citizens. The starting point will be for Africa and Friends of Africa to understand the importance of a new form of participatory and developmental democracy, what I refer to as redemocratization, which will involve the renegotiation and reconstitution of the social contract based on principles of egalitarianism and social justice. I argue that what Africa needs is not more of the same form of delegitimized democracy, but a brand new people-centric politics and economics that places the people their inclusion and participation in politics, governance, and peace at its core. It will involve redemocratizing power relations between rulers and the ruled, investing in the co-production of knowledge, supporting the building of new capable and participatory institutions and initiatives that add value to the lives of African people and the capacity of their states to deliver development and sustainable peace, while also expanding their access to global markets. However, I caution that Africa will have to rise to the challenges and opportunities presented by the current post-pandemic moment to work towards redemocratizing the continent if it is to seriously tackle the challenges linked to inequality, conflict, and peace on the continent. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi, for that insightful lecture. There were a lot of interesting things that you mentioned, and I would love to talk more about that. But before I ask my questions, I also want to remind our audiences, in case you have any questions, feel free to use the chat option that is on the right-hand side of your screen. Please use that. I'll be more than happy to ask those questions to Dr. Obi. So Dr. Obi, you talked about the structural inequalities in Africa, and you also talked about the colonial history and how government response to the pandemic basically worsened the inequality in African countries. I was wondering how much of it, the response of the government, is still the continuation of the colonial mindset, and what would you recommend be done to address this crisis?
Thank you very much. Can I respond to this, or we are going to collect questions?
Yes, sir, you can respond. And meanwhile,
Thank
if
you
there are
very
any
much.
other questions, yes.
I think the first thing is that when you look at the nature of the integration of Africa into what you call the global political economy, it was through colonialism. What it meant basically was that Africa's economies were structured to supply the needs of the colonizing countries, the colonial powers, as we choose to call them. And therefore, by the time independence came, if you look at commodities like gold, like oil, like cocoa or coffee, the economies were already externally oriented, and they were supposed to service the mother country. What it also meant was that the capacity to fix the prices of those goods lay outside of Africa. What it also meant is that those goods were traded in colonial currencies, either the CFA franc or the which is tied to the French franc, or initially the British pound, and later the king of currencies, the US dollar. And so what it means is that those economies basically work for the dominant powers in the global economy. And whenever there is a crisis at that level, those economies, because they are not designed to respond to domestic demands and domestic needs, there is a huge shortfall. And do not forget that along with that infrastructure of economic extraction is also a political equivalent, which is either authoritarian or in a formal manner democratic, but essentially oversees that process of extraction and transfer. And while doing that, also becomes a dominant elite that has access to those resources even as they go along the conveyor belt. They have access, they have resources, and those resources translate to power. And that is why there is this tendency to stay in power, because you do not want to lose that privilege of being in control of power. There is also the other dimension, of course, that when the African countries are now in a crisis because of the crisis from the global level, they also are given conditions by the Bretton Woods institutions that are also controlled and dominated by the same powers. And I know some time ago, when I was much younger, there was a book called Aid as Imperialism, in which aid then became part of the economic instruments in which Africa's future, not just its present, had to be tied to servicing the global economy. And it's that mismatch and the inequality between the subordination of Africa to global needs, as well as the reality of the inequality between African economies and the economies that they deal with. I'll give you an example. Nigeria does business with at least 4 multinationals, oil multinationals. By the time you bring together the profits and the income and the worth of those 4 companies, it's more than Nigeria's annual budget. And yet that is just 4 companies. So in terms of weighing them together, you will find out that there is no real basis for equality. And so the Nigerian state cannot really stand up. It's so dependent and also so unequal because it in itself is a product of inequality. And for it to stay in power and to reproduce the conditions of the integration of the country into the global economy, it of necessity has to also reproduce inequality within the country. And that's why at the first part of my talk, I spoke about projections in which 7 out of 10 Nigerians are expected to go into extreme poverty in the post-pandemic economy. And this is what we are really talking. Government response, I'll give you an example. During the shutdown, some countries canceled elections. Some countries, under the guise of restrictions on movement, arrested demonstrators. They arrested people who are going to work. They targeted the opposition. This in itself is reminiscent of some of the repressive actions of the colonial state during protests against excesses of the colonial state and the exploitation of colonial subjects. Government responses have unwittingly created even more problems because in shutting down the economies, governments have lost a lot of revenue. In violating human rights, they have built resentment against their rule and furthermore eroded their legitimacy, giving non-state actors incentives to attack symbols of the state. So it's like a kind of vicious cycle. You're trying to respond to a pandemic, you don't have enough vaccines, but you are able to project force on your populace to keep them compliant, but you are not able to resolve the real problems as the social contradictions continue to widen. I hope I have answered your question.
No, absolutely. So thank you so much for that. Going off of some of the things that you discussed in this particular answer, we have a question in the chat which says, prior to the pandemic, there were African voices like Dambisa Moyo who argued that Africa should stop receiving aid and concentrate on debt markets for development rather than aid. In the aftermath of the pandemic, do you think this idea is still valid?
I think people like Dambisa actually meant well when they asked for an end to aid dependence. But when you pay attention to the structure of Africa, it's a structural issue. It's all well and good to tell people not to take aid, but look at the structures of the economies that they operate. They cannot operate those structures outside of aid. So the real question is, what you really are asking them to do is to transform the nature of their economies away from dependency and therefore structurally remove the need for a particular kind of aid that only helps to reinforce underdevelopment and dependency. So she meant well. I think she means well. Now, in the post-pandemic era, most of the African countries are in serious crisis, and they are all back to the IMF and the World Bank. You listen to what is happening in places like Nigeria, like Ghana, like Ethiopia, like Kenya, even South Africa. They are all back to the Bretton Woods institutions and the Western creditors. And the debt profile has ballooned in a context where the real prices of their traditional exports or commodities have basically collapsed, with the exception of oil. But there is a crisis in terms of oil. While the war in Ukraine has created a demand for oil and gas, and African oil producers potentially have this opportunity to make a killing, literally. What is the situation in Nigeria, for example? In Nigeria, OPEC plus one gave Nigeria an oil quota of approximately 1.8 million barrels of oil to export per day. Guess what? By summer, Nigeria could not even meet the production of 1 million barrels per day. Why? Because of high levels of oil theft. Not just high levels of oil theft, aging infrastructure, and sabotage of oil installations. To even make the problem more complicated, Nigeria is Africa's largest producer and exporter of oil and one of the largest producers and exporters of natural gas. But guess what? Nigeria imports over 60% of refined petroleum products consumed in the country from outside the country. It's pretty much like a corn farmer importing popcorn. How do you explain that? Again, right. It goes back to the fact that 4 of Nigeria's refineries are out of order and have been out of order for upward of over 6 years. Right. Why can't those refineries be fixed and refine crude that is produced within the country? Your guess is as good as mine. Go ask the political elites. Go look at the structure of the oil industry, which was created to service the global market, not domestic demand. But we could go on and on, but I think I will pause there. But these are some of the challenges that we face. And rather than go back to the basics and go back to the fundamentals, what Africa is facing now is a new scramble. New countries are joining the fray. China is joining the fray. Turkey is there. Saudi Arabia is there. United Arab Emirates are there. More countries are coming into the continent to scramble. Right. But the fundamental issues is that it's not about changing your dancing partner. No, it's about the structure of the trade. Who benefits? What are you exporting? And what is the value added that you give before you export? You export crude oil, you import refined petroleum products. What is the value added? So I'll stop here and wait for the next question.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Obi. We have 3 more questions in the chat. Would you like me to say all those 3 questions together?
Please, no, we'll take one at a time.
Okay. So this is a comment and a question by Patrick. They say, thank you kindly, Dr. Obi, for your presentation and for highlighting such a pressing challenge in the post-COVID African continent. My question pertains to one of your last points with respect to democracy as an antidote to political inequality. I'm not entirely clear on what re-democratization means, precisely since I interpret democratization as dependent upon the contingencies of wants and needs of different publics, and the languages around the democratic practice and what is considered legitimate forms of democratic practice. How do you reconcile different cultural conceptions of democratic practice? How do you differentiate between understandings of solidarity and egalitarianism across cultural contexts? And how does your concept of re-democratization ground itself with an ear towards the particularities of different contexts without reproducing conditions that lead to further misrecognition and political inequality? Thank you again for your talk.
Wow, I guess I asked for that. It's it's a very good question. I think we need to take a step back to history. You know, before democracy, there was feudalism. And democracy started out, ideally, at least it was dressed up on the basis of certain principles: equality, freedom. And those are the two I actually mentioned in my paper: equality and freedom. And those are the enduring principles of democracy, in spite of cultural differences, in spite of what region of the world it's about. It was a historical movement for freedom and liberation from the feudal lords of Europe. That's basically democracy as a social movement. And that is where I am coming from. So when I am calling for redemocratization, it's actually two words: rediscovery and democratization. The question about democracy in Western societies was that usually democracy is really, interestingly, a rule by a group justified as democracy, representing freedom, equality, and liberty. And equality is equal rights for all. Everybody is equal, unlike in the feudal society where you had the lord and you had the serf. This ideal society, democratic society, says everybody is equal. And that's why you have the rule of law. Everybody is equal. And that is why you have equal rights to property and freedom of expression. So let's take democracy in terms of the principles that it offers: freedom, equality, liberty, or justice. These are the key principles that the movement that rose to challenge feudalism in Europe did. But what has happened since then? There is a connection, because the group that eventually inherited power after that social movement succeeded was a group that represented a new form of economy. And that is the economy that people, and I think it's a dirty word, but I'll say it all the same: the capitalist economy. So what you have really in the West is a capitalist democracy, a democracy by capitalists for capitalists. Now, the conundrum you have is that democracy was fought for. Revolutions were carried out in the name of these abiding principles. But the economic system that emerged alongside that system turned out to be one that breeds inequality, which flies in the face of some of those principles. So what do? We have continued on that road, and we are beginning to see that because of technological innovations, globalization, and some of the impacts of economic recession, you are seeing the rise of new groups that are beginning to see through those contradictions between the principles and the practice of democracy and what they consider to be their marginalization and their exclusion. So what do? You go back to the principles. That is my argument. You go back to the principles, you go back to your history, and you go back to your society. And you go back and talk to the people, and you interrogate the social contract in which you find yourself. Where are the inequities? Where are the contradictions? What exactly do? When democracy is aging, as we have seen in countries of the West, including this one, you have anxieties of democracy. And the anxieties of democracy manifest themselves in various ways, but you cannot keep on repeating the same thing, because the anxieties will not go away, the contradictions will not go away. What COVID has done is to widen and deepen these contradictions and these anxieties. And that is why my argument is that you need to go and rediscover those principles and how they apply to your case and see how you can then re-democratize. So I am not attacking the concept of democracy. I am saying we need to go back to those principles and then see how you redemocratize and redistribute power in Africa to ensure those things I'm talking about. I'm sorry I have to go on for a bit. Sorry.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and you have like 4 more questions in the chat. So I'm just going to ask them if you want me to, or I can just
No, let's do
send
the
it
4
to you.
questions. I'll just give one sentence answers.
Okay. So I'm just quickly going to ask you those 4 questions. First one is from Mario that says, can Africa benefit from relating to other areas from the global south, like Latin America, with a common story and colonial and neo-colonial regimes? Culturally and historically, Africa is an integral part of some economies in the region, like Brazil and Caribbean area. Then we have the second question from Christy that says, are the people of Africa immune to the inequalities? As in, are they not faced by the major inequalities seen? Also, does it contribute to lack or growth of interest to be heard or participation within individual governments? Then there's a comment by Mario that says the case of an oil producer, Nigeria, is similar to the case of Venezuela, also unable to meet the production quota because of internal conflict and boycott. Thank you very much, Dr. Obi, for an insightful talk. Then there's another question by Martin that asks, thank you for your very illuminating presentation, Professor Obi. Are there any bright spots on the continent in regards to democratization and popular development? What are some positive African development models, either past or present, that countries can strive to emulate? Then there is a final question by Deborah. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Obi. Do you think that the pandemic and the subsequent economic turmoil has, paradoxically, encouraged the current Ethiopian peace talks in South Africa, SA? If yes, does it show a change in African public opinion? And then Yasmin, Dr. Levine, thank you so much, Dr. Obi. I have to run to another meeting, but this was really thought-provoking.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think these are 5 questions. The first one is a simple answer. Yes, African economies and African countries can benefit from developing horizontal ties and learn from each other within the global south. Actually, it's very important that they do this. That's the first. Are Africans immune to inequalities? No, they are not. And that's why the conditions are so dire. And that's why you have a lot of these conflicts popping up all over the place, the demonstrations and the high levels of government repression. It's not that the people are not complaining. Some of them are just tired, they are apathetic, and they are more interested in where the next meal will come from because they know that if they go out into the streets, they are going to face repression. But quietly, there's something called a quiet revolution. Quietly in their rooms, in their shacks, and in various places, there is a lot of grievance and disenchantment. And people actually dream. But you see, you cannot imprison a people's dream. People dream of better times, but not all of them are able to pursue those dreams. And not all of them do so legitimately. The case of Venezuela, you are absolutely correct. Venezuela's case is also different, but Venezuela is caught in a slightly different kind of structural issue. But yes, it's the same thing. You have oil, but you cannot meet your quota because of domestic constraints. Are there any bright spots in Africa? That's a very difficult question. But the reality is that there are bright spots, but they are like scattered dots, and they are usually under the radar. There are a lot of grassroots initiatives where young people and some people are able to develop systems of self-sufficiency and what I call resilience. There are people who are creatively using what they call startups in Africa. Young people are displaying incredible levels of entrepreneurship. And there is so much innovation, technical innovation taking place in Africa. Communities are also doing a lot, but a lot of this is under the radar. And it's not, you don't have a critical mass coming together in any country that you can say, this is the model. There are scattered success islands of models. What we then need is to find a strategy to upscale them and provide the political framework within which they can thrive. And that is where re-democratization comes in. The peace talks in South Africa, I think the reality, and I'll speak here as a conflict and peace scholar, is that there is fatigue on both sides. I don't know how much COVID has contributed to that, but Ethiopia, like other African countries, is feeling the pinch of the global recession. When you are fighting a war and there's fatigue and nobody is getting any tactical advantage really in this war. I think the sensible thing is to go and see if you can find peace, and that's what Ethiopia and the Tigrayan people have tried to find in faraway Pretoria. I hope they succeed because Africa needs peace.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi, for your time, for your insightful talk, for answering all these questions. I mean, we would have loved to continue because I'm sure people have more questions, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'm really thankful for your time, and I will just pass on to Dr. Chowdhury for the closing remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi, for this very, very enlightening, as usual, talk. And thank you, Dr. Mushtaq, for moderating the talk. I'm also thankful to all the audience here. And this is our World Affairs lecture series. We do it every semester. And I'm very thankful to the Dean of Liberal Arts, and I'm also very thankful to Professor Levine. She had to leave for another meeting. She's the director of our Press Scholar Honors Program. So thank you all. It was wonderful. Emery, we cannot do this without Professor Emery's, the support. So thank you all.
Thank you for your kind attention, and thank you to the organizers and this wonderful audience. Really made my day. Thank you. So how do I get that?